So before I get into this effectiveness of challenging conversations, I want to share a quote from one of my favorite course developers and authors, Paul Extell. He said, "The most powerful stance to take is that difficult conversations can work out. I do think that anything can be handled or addressed through conversation if you're committed to turning out and willing to stay with it until it does, versus leaving in a huff or getting too frustrated to continue." So great words from Paul Extell there. So I'm curious, using the comments or the chat feature again, how effective are you today at having challenging conversations? So one might be comparable to Michael Scott from The Office. As bad as my example, so, pretty good, or you're a rock star. So what do you have? Where would you rate yourself? Uh-oh, we've got a Michael Scott here. Okay, so most folks are so good. So not as bad as I was, and not too many as bad as Michael Scott, but we're here to improve, right? That's why we're all here for a professional development session. So thanks for sharing that. Close the chat here. All right. So certainly, I think we can all agree that challenging conversations are just a part of life. So it's really up to us to get even better at them. We can do them. So many of us have them on a daily or weekly or very regular basis. So it's really in our best interest to get better at doing them. So one quote I love is in the book, Influencer, The New Science of Leading Change. How can we make the undiscussable discussable? And doing that in a professional, gracious way. You know, hard for all of us for sure, but that's something that I certainly aspire to. And then the other quote I love is just to be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. I would be willing to bet all of you in the professional field are good at the basic chat. You can have lots of conversations about lots of things that don't really matter, but there's so much in our work world that matters. And so how do we get that courage? How are we brave enough to start a conversation that matters? So I think a really great framework for me and how I've gotten from being terrible at having challenging conversations to actually being pretty good. I don't say that I can't wait to have them. I love them, but I'm actually pretty good at them now because of all this practice and learning from others. So what helps me tremendously is this question here, is what will this make possible? What will this conversation make possible? And so I do have a lot of hope and a lot of encouragement by knowing on the other side of the conversation, the possibility can be really positive. It can be a breakthrough for me and for others. So some things I've listed on what could this make possible, and I bet you have ideas too. It could improve a relationship, a company, an organization, a team. You can invoke positive change. Someone mentioned that in the comments earlier. You can create solutions to problems. You can improve your health. You can grow your career. You can advance your career. You can get what you want. So just a quick check-in with you all. What are some other things that you think having a challenging conversation would make possible once you get through the other side? Yes, Kelsey, clear expectations. That's a great one. Sure, better work-life balance, open lines of communication, always a good thing. Certainly better understanding of where the other person is coming from. Really appreciate that, Jennifer, because there's at least two of us in the conversation. Yep, communication perspective. So I think it's really helpful to just keep that question in front of you. Something that question would have really helped me a lot all those years ago after my conversation with my manager and my performance review is, what would the conversation with him after that performance review make possible? All right, so what I'm going to offer you is a model for challenging conversations. I'm a really visual person and I do well with models. And this is something that I'm hoping will help you not only as you prepare for conversations, but even if you find yourself in the middle of a conversation that's, whoa, challenging, you can think about this model and it can help you. All right. So you'll notice in my model here, you're going to think about your role in the conversation. So over on the far left, I have a participant role and a lead role. And I don't mean this in a like a hierarchy standpoint. I mean, sometimes you are in charge of the conversation, you're leading the conversation, and sometimes you're just a participant, but you have equal responsibility in making sure it turns out. And someone did a great job, I think it was Jennifer, mentioning earlier in the comments that it's important to understand where they're coming from. So in those conversations, sometimes you and I can get really sucked into, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What is my rebuttal? But really, it's important to not only consider yourself and what you're thinking and feeling, but the other person as well. And that will serve you very well when it comes to being seen as professional in the conversation. So very briefly, I'm going to go through each of these in depth. So the first section I'm calling plan and prepare for the conversation. The second one is be here now when you're in the conversation. And finally, follow up and follow through. Those are, again, just a visual that helps me kind of get through the conversation. And I'll have to say that not everybody really considers all three of these sections, but I'm going to tell you about why you should. And then lastly, as I mentioned a little bit early on, is it's great if you have the opportunity to plan ahead for your conversation, whether you're delivering a performance review or you're planning a one-on-one or whatever it is. But it's another thing to go, holy cow, this conversation's been going on for 2 minutes and I'm in a really challenging conversation. And so I'm hoping that regardless of the situation, these tips and tactics can help you. So I'm going to start here over here on the left with before the relationship. So thinking about planning for a conversation, I would challenge you to say this is a great opportunity to have the mindset of building that relationship before you have a challenging conversation with someone. So it's really important, as my notes say, to plan when, where, and even a privacy standpoint when it comes to your conversations. So thinking again, not only about yourself, but the other person, what makes sense from a where and when conversation. It's not always a great time to have a conversation. And I would suggest that you probably know best. When is the best time? You know, some people are like, never have this terrible, challenging conversation on a Friday afternoon or a Monday morning or something like that, or right before someone's going on vacation. Just be thoughtful. The point here is to be thoughtful about when is the best time and where is the best location to have a conversation. I really recommend in most cases to give the person advance notice. So request the discussion, the topic, even the desired outcome, and maybe even why you want to meet. You don't have to write a whole novel, but you and I like to think about things sometimes before we have those conversations. And so it'd be helpful to people to have that information in advance. Make sure that you're really thinking about their viewpoint, and you're probably missing important information. I mean, my goodness, how many times have you and I screwed something up, a relationship temporarily, hopefully, or even a conversation because we thought we knew the facts of the situation, but really it was just interpretation or even things that we had incorrect. I really recommend writing a talk sheet. I don't mean like a full-blown dissertation by any means. I just mean writing out notes to yourself to make sure that you're covering the really important points of your conversation. So not a script, because the conversation is going to go back and forth and the other person's not going to have the script, but writing out the important notes for yourself. I want to cover points A, B, and C. I want to get to objective D, and I want to do that within this time frame. Sometimes it helps to practice the conversation. Here you use the words when you're having the conversation, or maybe even using someone, a colleague, a trusted colleague, as a sounding board so that they can maybe ask you questions that occur to them to help you prepare for the conversation you're going to have. And then also give you feedback on how you're coming across. Like, gosh, you know, that phrase that you used sounded really mean or really hurtful or really unkind. And so can you think about how to rephrase that a little bit? And then another thing to think about is your attitude, your tone of voice, and your body language. And boy, that's a lot to think about, isn't it? But it's just something to consider and think through when you're talking about planning for, preparing for a conversation with someone else. And then if you're in the participant role, and so an example, when you're aware of something coming up is a performance review or a one-on-one or a meeting or something like that. If you have documents to review in advance, do that. Really shows the person that is leading the session, you come, you're prepared, you really care about what they have to share, and you're treating it like it matters. And then also think about how you want to be perceived. And this is a place where you and I get tripped up sometimes because we're so consumed with how we're feeling, how we're so right and they're so wrong, and maybe some emotions, that it's helpful to get in touch with how do I want to be perceived. And most of us in the work will want to be perceived as professional, gracious, mature. And so think about how I want to be perceived in that conversation. Also good to think about your attitude, your tone, your body language, trying to show up and show that you're really professional and you want to be there. And even though it might be a challenging conversation, that you can handle it like an adult. And then certainly you can think through some questions that you might want to have. And in the question space, it's always helpful to think about open-ended questions and really avoiding kind of those pointed, accusatory questions, of course. So I really think another important reminder for all of us is, do you care more about being right or the relationship itself? And a lot of us really love to be right, hate to be wrong, but think about the relationship with your boss, with your coworker, with a direct report, with a supplier. Really think about how that relationship can really forward what the two of you are trying to do for your organization. What are you trying to produce together? And in many cases, those are going to be longer term relationships that really need to be effective to support both of you, but also the organizations that you are supporting. So think about when you're preparing for the conversation, and even when you're in the conversation, am I really preserving this relationship, or do I care more about being right? So the middle of the section here is the conversation itself. And this is what you and I jump to most immediately when we think about challenging conversations. So my mantra for this particular section is be here now. You've prepared for the conversation. So when you're in the conversation, think about, how can I be my really best self and preserve this relationship during the conversation? So choose the mindset that I'm really going to listen. I'm going to listen really carefully and consider their perspective. I'm not going to go in with a wall built up and saying, I already know, or they're stupid, or they don't know what they're doing, or whatever. Really listen and consider their perspective. Sounds a little bit new agey, but I'm going to really tell you that breathing, remaining calm is going to help tremendously. I've had lots and lots of these challenging conversations where I've been sort of the leader, and even some where I've been the participant. And I've even had to remind sometimes people to breathe if they're getting especially disappointing news. It's important, I mentioned this already, to be present, to be professional, gracious, and empathetic. So put away any of your distractions, really treat the conversation like it matters, and help the other person understand you are there to work with them to preserve your professional relationship and together to move forward in a positive way. Make sure you stick with it until it's resolved. Sometimes that means more than one meeting, but don't, resist the urge to leave in a huff, resist the urge to shut down and shut the other person out. Stick with the other mindsets that I've been talking about already. Stick with it until it's resolved. Another important point is thinking about intent versus impact. So I'm a really direct communicator. I know that people who know and love me would say I'm a little too direct sometimes, but I don't sugarcoat. Well, think about the intent of what you're trying to say, and then also the impact that it could have on the other person. And sometimes a few tweaks in the words or the questions can really make a positive difference. And the last thing on the mindset is thinking about not making them wrong. And so you and I don't often intend to make people feel like they're wrong, but sometimes our words make them feel wrong. Like, you never do this, or you always do this. So think about some of that extreme language, because that often leads to you and I making other people feel wrong or look wrong. And then getting into specific tactics. Really important, as I mentioned, to be direct, to be fact-based and specific. Vague accusations or vague examples really don't help any of us. We come to work and we try to do a really great job for our organization, but we're masterpieces in progress. We are imperfect. And so we really need help of our boss and our colleagues to help us understand, You did A, B, and C in a really great way. D, could we talk about that? Adjust your approach a little bit next time. Make sure you ask open-ended questions like how, or help me understand, or those kinds of things, kind of open-ended, to make sure that you're not communicating back to that person's wrong. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes a wrong word trigger is the word why. So we've heard of a tactic of the 5 whys. Many of us probably have, but just be careful about why. It's not always a bad idea, but often it can be a trigger in kind of shutting down the conversation or feeling accusatory. When you are sharing your case for something, you're trying to get something different, you're trying to move forward with something you want, sometimes it's helpful to share the why yourself. Here's why I think I deserve this raise. Here's why I'd like us to change our approach to this problem. And also, as you're talking with the other person, think solutions based. So there's lots of ways to be right. How can the other person and you come together with some solutions that can work for both of you? And hopefully you can come up with a couple of them. Make sure that you save room for questions, and then certainly take notes as well. Depending on the conversation, it's good to have those notes, because a lot of times we forget. We have this really challenging conversation, and it's easy to forget sometimes what we committed to or what they asked us to complete after the meeting itself. I think another important point here I'd like to remind you of is to ask for what you want. And I gave just a couple examples just now, but I'm going to repeat a couple of them here. So for example, I'm requesting a raise of 7% because I accomplished A, B, and C this year, which had a very positive impact on our organization. Or I'm the boss and I'm giving feedback to my direct report. I'd like you to commit to responding to our customers within 24 business hours. So what I'm doing here is I'm giving you specifics. Think about what you want and be willing to ask for what you want, not just what you think you can get. And so I think it's an important consideration as you're having a challenging conversation, back to being direct, back to being collaborative, back to being solutions-based, is think about, ask for what you want. You may not always get it, but you should ask. I love this quote too. So when it comes to risky, controversial, and emotional conversations, skilled people find a way to get all relevant information from themselves and others out into the open. So this is back to making the undiscussable discussable. It's also back to having the conversation, having the courage to have a conversation that matters. So something I learned a long time ago from one of my best bosses I ever had, Phyllis, is this phrase. It makes perfect sense to them. So I don't know how many times you've been in you've had this feeling in a conversation. I bet you I have had it every single day at some point where I think, that person is crazy, or that will never work, or I can't even believe they're asking me that, or they are just cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I don't know where they're coming from. But a phrase that I remind myself on a regular basis is, it makes perfect sense to them. So a lot of times, you and I are in those conversations and we are not connecting, we are disagreeing, we are thinking they are just way out there. It's really helpful to tell yourself, especially when they say something really wild, it makes perfect sense to them. Again, it gets back to thinking about them, not only thinking about yourself, but thinking about them in the conversation and having a really effective conversation with someone else. And then finally, the last section. So after the conversation, you may think, whew, got through that conversation. I am done. I am out of here. I'm going to go have some milk and cookies to celebrate because I made it through. But really, as equally important to the prep of the conversation and the be here now, the conversation itself, is after the conversation. So that's where you can really work to maintain that relationship. You might need to ask for a follow-up conversation. You might need to ask for more information. You can acknowledge the other person, even if it was a little bit bumpy. You could send them an email and say, thanks for the conversation. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I wasn't aware. here are the 3 things I committed to after our conversation, or here are the 3 things that you said you were going to share with me, or here's the document that I said I would share with you. And then continually look for opportunities to reset the relationship in a positive way. Again, when you and I have bumpy conversations with people, especially if there's hierarchy involved, whether it's the boss or the direct report, we feel a little bit icky sometimes about that relationship, or we kind of want to avoid them. I challenge you to kind of turn and consider a different perspective, which is how can you just keep building that relationship a little bit? I'm not talking about brown nosing. I'm just talking about this relationship, this work relationship is important. And so, how can you, after your challenging conversation, continue to maintain a good relationship with that person? So, this is a laundry list, and this is actually something that Megan sent to you on Friday. And so, you have this as well as you have some of the other slides. Over these many years of being in the professional organizations, I have benefited greatly from conversation helpers. And so I'm going to be quiet here and let you read this list. And once you're done reading it, in the chat comments, if you wouldn't mind sharing a couple that you might like to try out, they might sound like you, there's something that could help you possibly. So I'll be quiet and just wait for you to share in the chat. Yeah, thanks, Laura. Using what else is really effective, I would agree. It kind of peels that onion sometimes, and it also gets at what people are maybe a little hesitant to share straight out of the chute. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's a good point. To your point, so many of us are not used to actually being listened to. It's kind of missing in our world, I would suggest. And so when you actually are listened to, it can feel a little confronting, but you'll get the hang of it. All right, thank you. Yep. Help me understand is one of my favorite ones as well, because my direct communication approach would have been more like, what the heck are you talking about? So help me understand is much more professional. And I got that from one of my bosses as well a long time ago. All right, thanks for sharing that. And like I said, you already have this list and you can kind of look through it as you prepare for your next challenging conversation. And maybe there are phrases in here that could help you so that when you're in the moment, you be here now, you're being present in your conversation. Maybe some of these can help you as they've helped me so that you can continue to be present and not have to fumble around for some words. All right, just a quick word on common traps and pitfalls. I've talked about these a little bit already, but don't do what I do with my boss back when in my early 20s, avoiding the conversation you really need to have. Really think about what's possible on the other side and trying to focus on what's possible so that you can lean into that conversation and not avoid it. Don't be bickering in email. If you need to have a conversation, make sure you have the conversation. Sometimes what this means about not having the conversation with the right person is don't be gossiping around about someone behind their back. Can you believe what Laura did? Can you believe what Lisa did? I can't believe that she did that crazy thing. Really go to the person directly and have the conversation using some of the mindsets and the tactics we've talked about. I talked about already, avoid those superlatives or generalizations, that extreme language like you always and you never and whatever, because that can be really confronting for people and be triggering for them when it comes to feeling negative or feeling wrong. Be sure to distinguish the facts versus the interpretations. That's really important. A lot of times our quickness and the ready pace of our lives likes to mash those two together, but really think through, is it a fact or is it an interpretation? And deal with the facts. Keep your eyes set on the end goal, getting to the other side. What does this conversation make possible? Don't give up, stick with it. Don't give in, don't go silent. Don't get resigned about whatever's happening. Stick with it, because if you do, it'll turn out. Make sure that when you're looking at that fact versus interpretation, that sometimes people's input, their facts, their opinions aren't necessarily facts. So just because my boss, John, was questioning my work ethic doesn't mean that I had questionable work ethic. It was just his perception at the time. It was a question he had at the time. And then taking things personally. Gosh, don't we do that almost every day and every conversation as well? Really avoid that or that feeling of taking things personally. Keep it professional, keep it about the facts, and focus on the solutions going forward. So, quick word about virtual challenging conversations. I think it's important, back to my comment about ask for what you want. Is there any way to have that conversation in person? Can you meet? And so, of course, I'm talking about this in the context of COVID. Obviously, I'm not talking about if you have international colleagues, you're not going to fly to Germany for a conversation probably. But if at all possible, can you have the conversation in person? Can you meet in a park? Can you go for a walk? How could you do it creatively and possibly meet with them? Or secondarily, can you have a video session? Can you actually say, I want to see your face on video. Can we have a conversation? And then, just like we've talked about before, I have it at the bottom here, but follow the model. So provide the setup information for the individual. Make sure, are we Zooming? Are we Skyping? Are we WebExing? What's the phone number? Making sure that all that information is provided in advance. Make sure that your environment is private and distraction free. So I am sure that just like me, you have cute kids and cute cats, but try to keep those out of the distraction arena for that particular challenging conversation. And then I think it's also good, especially in a virtual conversation, to follow up with an email on, here's what I heard, here's what I think we agreed to, or here are my action items. Because again, so much of the conversation can get lost if we don't follow up with it in writing. And then, as I mentioned, so much of that model that I was sharing with you earlier, and which you have in an email from Megan, can really help you in the virtual conversations as well. So, some reminders as we head down the home stretch here. Challenging conversations are a part of life. I bet many of you have some planned for this afternoon or yet this week. But remember, you're fine and you can handle it if you really focus on the possibility. What does this conversation make possible on the other side? You have a choice about if and how you engage in the conversation, so don't feel like you don't have a choice. Just embrace it and work toward a solution. And then back to the model: plan and prepare, be here now, and follow up and follow through. So, a quick word about the personal side. This is obviously a conversation about professional development, but we are multidimensional people and we all have personal lives as well. So, what I would suggest on the personal side, just to not avoid that topic at all, is consider using the same model and the tactics. So many of those can work for you on your personal challenging conversations as well. Although, let's admit, the stakes are a lot higher. Some of those challenging conversations can be a lot harder when it's someone you love or someone you care very deeply for. And just like with our work conversations, it may require a series of conversations. So think about, gosh, I have this huge ordeal or this huge challenge I need to work through with this individual. Don't necessarily feel the pressure of having to put all your eggs in one basket. Maybe it's a series of conversations.